Welcome to the Mission Minded Podcast. I am your host, Rachel Miller, and I have the privilege of leading this podcast with my best friend and co-host, Bella Comfort. Our mission is to fulfill the Great Commission by bringing our listeners closer to Jesus through each conversation. We hope that through our deep conversations, those who know Jesus can find a new appreciation for Him and His Word, while those who may not know Jesus at all can have a starting place to understand what it means to truly know Him and become a disciple of Jesus. We want to cover everything from the basics to the more complex topics that can get lost in the weeds. So let's dive right in.
Welcome back to the Mission Minded Podcast. We are here again with our friend Dr. Anstine, and we are kind of just going to pick up where we left off in the last episode, talking about Dr. Anstine, you're called to feed hungry sheep, and then get into more science-related topics, specifically ontology. If you don't know what that is, like Rachel and I, and stick around because Dr. Anstine will explain it. So Dr. Anstine, something that Rachel and I have talked about a little bit and you've told us about is how in your life you have like a mission, and that when you're asked to do certain things, you think to yourself like, does that fall into like the mission you've given yourself for your life? And you've talked about feeding hungry sheep, and it kind of falls around that. And so that's just, we both thought that was a really cool way of like looking at what am I doing with my time? How am I spending my life, basically? Yeah. And so would you want to dive more into that, like what that looks like for you?
Sure. It's kind of funny. I was trying to think, where did we leave off last time? And I love that you reminded me of, okay, that's where we left off. We have, so there's vocation, right? There's calling, there's mission. We use these words to try to describe what in the world am I doing, right? Why do I get up in the morning? Why do I go to work? Part of that can be vocation. How does vocation and calling, can they intersect? Can they come together? Can they be united? Or do I just go to work, check my brain at the door, do my job, get my paycheck, come home, and now this is my real life, right? In our society, especially the Western society, there's this bifurcation of most of the things we do. And we'll hopefully flesh some of this out in future podcasts about the bifurcation of the church, right? I've got my private life. Oh, that's your church life. And oh, good for you. But out here in the workplace, out here in the real world, we don't bring that, that church stuff into there. And that's a myth. And we need to break through on how do we, as Francis Schaeffer would say, how do we unite those? Or even in you on the right side, how do we unite the two so long lead us join? Right? Mm-hmm. And hopefully we can flesh on that down the road. But a calling for me and a vocation for me were separate for quite a while. I was climbing, as we talked about, that corporate ladder of chemistry. Wanting to do chemistry, was really motivated. The company I worked for was so cool. I mean, we were developing SNX 111 at the time, now it's like Priel, this advanced pain medication. It was one of the most fascinating things to be able to take my organic chemistry, blend that with a little biochemistry and then some biology, and then make, actually a molecule that was really helpful for humanity. It was really fun. But I realized in that the Lord, there was a stirring in my heart. And part of that stirring was like, I love chemistry, but there's got to be more to it than 118 elements and my beloved carbon. So what then am I supposed to be doing with this chemistry thing? Right. So again, like we talked, last podcast, there was this split, there was this chasm, there was this almost like a tension in my soul. And it wasn't until I said yes and said, okay, Lord, I'm going to go up to, Idaho and teach chemistry, that began to like, okay, now I'm starting to see, you want me to teach chemistry in the context of people's lives and then integrate those. Okay, I got that. Right. But there still wasn't a clear, this is why I'm teaching chemistry. So there was this, I've got the chemistry side of it, and I love the teaching side of it, but I didn't understand how that was supposed to come together, right? And it wasn't until I'd actually been teaching for about a year and a half. A friend of mine said, "Hey, have you read The Pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer?" And I said, "Oh no, because as we've talked about, I love to read." And I was like, that's something I've kind of thought about and had on the back of my my reading list. Oh, I should read that. You really love it. So at the time in my life, I was frustrated. I was like, Lord, I see all these beautiful students and yet I'm only captive audience with about 25 to 35, depending on the class size. But yet I look out at this campus of over 1,000. I'm like, Lord, how do we get to, what can we do to teach them more truths about you and a walk with you and what it looks like to apprentice and disciple with you. And it came to this frustration. And so that coupled with, okay, now I start to read this book, The Pursuit of God. And it's crazy because I was just pleading with the Lord. You've got to open doors, Lord. There's got to be something we can do to teach, to integrate this whole beauty of a walk with you, a discipleship, apprenticeship with you. And the opening, that's actually an introduction of the Pursuit of God, Tozer quotes Milton, and Milton was the prior century. And Tozer uses these words. He says, "And the hungry sheep look up and are not fed." And I was like, yes, Lord, this is exactly my frustration on campus, that I see all these beautiful sheep and no one's feeding them. Lord, you've got to bring people to feed these sheep. You've got to bring people to, and I began to pray that actively in my times with the Lord and wrestle with him, like, Lord, all these sheep, they're looking up, Lord, they're not being fed. And then it clicked. And that's your call.
Wow.
I want you to feed hungry sheep. And in it echoes, because what does Jesus ask Peter, late in the Gospels? Like, Peter, do you love me? Well, feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Tend my lambs. He's using this metaphor of feeding my sheep. And so apprenticeship, probably the biggest aspect of it is feeding sheep, right? And so it's been really freeing, because I have a lot of people say, hey, why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? But it's now easy to say no. It doesn't align with the calling on my life to feed hungry sheep. I don't need to have just more things. None of us do, right? We were just talking about that before we start, that we have so many things in our lives. We don't need to say yes to everything, because then to me that kind of dilutes us down from the calling on our life. So the beauty for the integration of the chemistry, or I should say my vocation with my calling is to feed hungry sheep. But I can do that through the lens of chemistry, because I don't have to check my brain at the science door of chemistry and then have this whole, now I'm going to go disciple. It's like, no, I can disciple while I'm teaching chemistry, which is why I love to teach chemistry, because I get to teach about the great chemist who brought the periodic table together and how he used carbon nitrogen reduction to build these amazing molecules that we play with as organic, medicine. And so that's, I start my 27th year this fall, right, of that calling. And so it's a fun journey to be able to integrate both my love of Jesus and my love of science, and they just come together beautifully into this merging of, you're going to get as much Jesus in GChem as you're going to get the elements, right? Because there's no way I can't talk about the great Logos of John 1:1 without talking about what that means and why John uses that. Maybe some podcasts we can flesh that first out, because it's powerful. So yeah, that's
okay. That's cool.
Amazing.
I love just that mentality of like, my life is a mission, and like, I'm gonna spend my time wisely. Does that like, you're obviously a busy guy, you get asked to like present and do like a lot of different things. Does that kind of shape the things you say yes to and the things you say no to? Because like, I know you get asked to do a lot of weddings, but you're like, that's not my mission.
And thank you for asking me, because I loved yours. And that was a real privilege. And in fact, I've just said no to 2 weddings this past spring, just because it's not something that I don't want to just do unless I'm really connected. Like, like you guys, I was like, oh, yeah, that's like a no-brainer, because we have been walking together for 3 years.
Yeah.
So that was real special. Whereas a couple of the other ones were just, and so it's not something I feel called to unless I'm really connected. So yes, so it's easy for me. I'm having coffee with an individual tomorrow on some international thing, but it's feed hungry sheep. It's to feed hungry sheep. I'm like, okay, now that, Lord, if that's from you, I'll say yes. But if it's just busy work, right? It's easy to just say, it's just not my calling. As you guys know, I'm not a detail person. That's why you guys are doing the back end of this. I'm not, right? How long have we wanted to do something like this?
For so long. Like, definitely since I would say 2021.
Yes.
And this so interconnects with why we're starting this podcast, because for myself, I know that I've struggled with saying no. I want, like, the Lord has put it on my heart to serve. And even back when we lived together in 2022, I just poured out and poured out and poured out. And I just got so burnt out because I wanted to give. I wanted to serve. But I now like am trying to be more mission focused. And why we even have this podcast named Mission Minded is because the whole point of this is that we are having our minds focus on our mission. And what is our mission? What does that look like? And so that kind of relates to that.
Yeah. And I feel like also in our society, it's like things are so fast and there's so much to do. And like there's so many just like ways to spend your time that your time can just like waste away like before like you even realize that your time's gone. And so it's like, okay, like I want to be intentional with how I spend the time God's given me on earth. And what does that look like? And are the things that I'm doing on my day-to-day in line with the mission that God's put on my life?
Yeah. And like the gospel says, our life is but a dust, like a speck in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And in the moment, it feels like it's so long, but it's not.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited that we get to do this and hopefully share so many things that will help people get fired up about the Lord again and understand our why.
Well, and Rachel, I want to piggyback just real quickly because I know we've got a couple questions that we really want to get through or work through a process today. One of the more influential, and you guys talked about the book list on episode 2. One of the more influential books that I've read in the last probably 4 years was Imagine Heaven. And I've mentioned this a little bit, but that book, it kind of made the church circuit for a while. But in that book, I'll just give you the kind of the overview. It's a engineer skeptic who was heard about these near-death experiences. And he's really skeptical, like, all right, this is a bunch of hooey, right? This is a bunch of magic and smoke and mirrors. And so he began to actually study these things. And he studies over 1,000 of them. And he's like, okay, there's something here. Because people are doing things, as you would know as a nurse, like the guy is coded, not just coding, but coded. There's no tone, there's nothing. The guy is dead. And the nurse takes his dentures out, puts them in the bottom drawer, and then keeps working on him. And he, literally, half hour, 20 minutes, I forget what that story was, comes back to life. A couple days later, and he's in a different room. And like, could you go grab my teeth? And they're like, oof, no one could remember where they were. And he said to him, you put them in the bottom drawer of the cart. And there's like this type of thing, there's no way you would have known this, right? I know. And sure enough, they go look at that cart, there they are. And like that. And this is so he begins to study these, right? And anyway, and the whole synopsis of the book is there is something to these people that come out of body, whatever, go to this light. And so the summary of the book, though, is so powerful. And this is what makes it so cool. And it talks about if it's not light, anyway, that's what makes the books like, wow, they're not all good interactions. But the overview of the book is basically this idea of this loving source of light, I call it Jesus, the Logos, has two things in common. The question to these people as a whole, not all of it, but the number one thing was, what did you do with the life I gave you?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think every morning now that I wake up, it's like, what am I going to do today with the life that you've given me?
Yeah.
Right? Am I going to waste it? Am I going to just, do a bunch of reels? Am I going to listen to talk radio, listen to sports radio, do whatever? Or am I going to be intentional? Because the second question that was unanimous was, did you love well? Mm-hmm. So how do you bring together, what did you do with the life I gave you? And did you love well? Those have changed the way I live my life. They changed the way I wake up in the morning. Mm-hmm. So for me to love is to feed hungry sheep, is to take my passion for who I'm learning Jesus to be and say, Lord, when I leave someday, when I stand before you someday, I want you to say, you fed well. Mm-hmm. Well done. You fed well. You didn't waste the life I gave you. Yeah. Nothing against talk radio and sports radio. I'm done with those. Mm-hmm. I haven't listened to talk radio. I can't remember the last time I listened to talk. I used to listen to the rest of them all the time. But I don't do that because to me, it's now, if I'm gonna listen to something, I'll listen to a book or I'll listen to a podcast. Mm-hmm. I'll listen to something that is meaningful, that's uplifting, helping me understand something better. So.
Oh, yeah. For myself, I am not a good reader. And so I feel like I just find myself, I read the Bible when I read because, again, like with the time that I have, if I already don't read a lot, I might as well read the Bible or read a book that is aligned with like the word or somebody who's speaking to or about Jesus. Because I'm just bad at reading. Anyway.
And this is kind of going back to something we talked about last time, but you had mentioned how like when people say you can't trust the Bible, what they're really saying is like, you could trust me more than the Bible. And I was actually talking with some people who had listened to that episode, and they really loved that point. And they actually were wondering, like, do you have any author recommendations of people that you feel are credible and that like we can trust?
Okay, so and it's funny. I was just teaching to some engineers on some science and faith stuff, and that question came up, like, where would you start? If you really want to get into beginning to assimilate a worldview, a biblical worldview, where in the world would you start? Because that's what I love about this podcast. There is so much undoing to go forward. So it's almost like we've got to go back to go forward. At the conference I was telling you about in Dallas here in a few weeks, the whole thing is repairing the ruins. That's the whole theme. And the idea is we've got some ruins that we need to go back and undo so that we can go forward. And one of those is establishing, breaking out of, I think it was you in episode 1 talked about some of your church upbringing. We had good stories, we had good activities, but I was kind of missing that foundation. And I get off to college and I'm like, there's got to be something more to this, right? There was a hunger for establishing something a little deeper.
Yes.
Where do we start establishing that foundation? Because oftentimes we've built a house, our faith, right, which I don't like that word, but our religion, our worldview, in the Greek, it was the paideia, this idea of the inculcation of everything that's come together to make me who I am, right? That's our house. And oftentimes we're looking at it going, there's not much of a foundation on this. So sometimes we have to like, okay, let's move the house off for a second and let's get in. And that's what we talked about for me personally, going back and going, no, wait a minute. That tension of either I've missed something or you're a liar, right? There was the tension with my soul. It was like, and I know you're not a liar, so I must have missed something. So that work of a decade of my own journey of going back and like, what foundation was laid or wasn't laid, and where do I start? So to your question, I would encourage you, and one of there's so many books I could throw at people, but it's overwhelming. In fact, when you come to my office, I don't know if you guys remember,
There's a lot.
that whole 2 rows up above my desk, those are all giveaway books. Those are all books I've bought multiple copies of. So if I'm talking with a student, I kind of, and they're readers. They're not just going to take it, thank you, Dr. Anstine, to set it on a bookshelf and forget about it. But they're hungry. They want to jump in. And they're going to read, then I'll be, okay, hey, let's work through this book together. Or why don't you read this over the summer, come back, but I'll give it to you for free as long as you come back in the fall and do a book report with me in my office, right? I want you to use those resources. The number one resource I would start with is establishing some type of foundation on truth. When we break down that Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and we hinted on the way a little bit prior, but when he talks about the way, the truth, and the life, we need to understand what he means by truth. Because one of the things as a scientist that I think is so important is to understand what is truth and where does it come from. We're in a culture that believes in relative truth. And by the way, just to set it correct, there's no such thing as a relative truth. By definition, truth is truth. And if you remember from Authentic Christianity, as Ray Stedman says, what was true today was true 10 years ago, and what is true today will be true in 10 years. There's no equivocation with truth, right? Now, we've substituted relative truth. What we really mean is opinion. What we don't mean is truth. So again, we've lost the real teeth of what truth means. So I always say, because, and this is powerful for me, my mentor who helped me find Jesus in my deepest, darkest brokenness, the one that handed me authentic Christianity, is arguably the smartest person I've ever had the privilege of walking with in this life. His name is Lambert Dolphin. He passed away a few years ago. He loved on me. He mentored me. His whole life mission was to feed hungry sheep, and I was one of the sheep that got to feed in his pasture. And he pointed me to Jesus like no one I could ever explain. And one of the things that he did in his life as a high-end, I can't explain to you. I've never seen a mind like this. He could be talking to me, typing on his, and we had a podcast or something going on in the background. And all 3 conversations, he can tell you exactly, his mind just worked in a very different way than most people. But he was also a high-end particle physicist at Stanford Research Institute. So he's a very deep thinker in the sciences. All that to say, which is why I probably fell in love with his mind. And he didn't just grow up in the church and it's all church, and great. He actually went through the science route, and he always told me, he said, never stop seeking truth no matter where you are in your journey. He said, because as I was going through my deep science, and as I was working in these scientific, very high-end labs, he would have people say, here's the Hindu great books, and here's the Buddhist great books. And he said, I'd read them all. I read Mormon. I read the Book of Mormon. And he said, and it wasn't until I was later in my life, I think it was his mid-30s, if I remember right. He says, I had one of my colleagues say, have you read the Bible? He's like, no, I never have. Hands him a Bible. Now get this. This is Lambert. This is the way his mind works. He reads it twice, cover to cover. Okay. And right, you're like, wait, the whole Bible? Yes, twice. And he says, the first time I went through it, I got into the book of John, and he says, for the first time, that is true. Because his whole life he'd been seeking truth. And this is why Jesus says, you will know the truth. And it will what?
Set you free.
Set you free. Free of what? Have we filled in the question of what Jesus was referring to? Being lost in the myopia of humanistic thought, my selfness, my narcissism, all this stuff that I get messed up into my own thinking. And Jesus is saying, no, follow me as the way, the truth, and life is the natural product of that, right? And so that whole idea of seeking truth is where I would start. And that's why the book I would hand to people, it used to be a book called Total Truth. Now, here's why, same author of the book I'm going to tell you about, but I have to preface it with this. Total Truth, if you really have the time, it's about this thick. Nancy Pearcey is one of my heroes in the apologetic world. She's an understudy of Francis Schaeffer. She's a wicked smart. She was a skeptic. She went to the Library Institute under Schaeffer and became an absolute follower of Jesus because of the logic side and the reason side, and says this guy is true. And so she writes this book called Total Truth, her journey, but it's big, it's deep, it's thick, and it's not accessible. I kept handing it out to people, and people would be like, I got about to chapter 4 and just went, I'm like, okay, we can't do that. That's not going to help. It's not going to help to blow people out of the water who are like, okay. So thankfully, and by the way, I almost had her come down and do speak, which is really cool. Yeah, we were in conversation, and it's a long story, but how it didn't happen, but it was really cool that she was going to come speak to us. She ended up, and I think it was her husband who said, we need to tone this down a little bit and make something more accessible. So she wrote a book called Finding Truth. That's where I would start.
Okay.
Finding Truth. Let's make sure we know what's the really real. And maybe that's what we should spend a little bit of time on, because when we talk about truth, it's the way things really are, right? Yeah. The question that we have to then ask ourselves is, then how are things really? Which gets us a little bit into the ontological side of things. The really real is a weird concept, because if you've ever stopped to ponder what is ultimate reality, right? And a lot of people probably never really ponder that and really even care. Right? Like we were talking about, just get up, do my job, have a little music, a little football, and I'm good to go. But if we really are curious, what's absolute reality? What's the really real? And I use the term really real because that's to me what I want to know. And this isn't from Stedman or from Lambert or, this is something that I've pondered and spent a lot of time on, because as a lover of science and a lover of Jesus, how do those two come together? And the question I ask myself keeps going back, because on my journey that we talked about in episode 2, I wanted to undo this house and go down to the foundation. And what's the very bedrock, right? What is the very cornerstone of my belief in what ultimate reality is? I want to go that far down into, and that to me as a scientist is, well, then what's really real? Because as a scientist, you can't tell me it's energy. Can't tell me it's matter. Can't tell me it's light, photons, gravity. All these things that we play with, they're just a manifestation of something. There's something, if you move all those out, what do you still have? Right? And even if you do a little thought experiment, if you take all the particles out of like a test tube, you put them under a vacuum, perfect vacuum, you take everything out and it's just empty space, you still have something. That's frustrating. Because we oftentimes think of, well,
sorry, I just got excited because that clicked in my brain some memory back to when I first met you, when you first said why is there some, or I want to phrase this properly, why is there something out of nothing, or how is there something out of nothing? Coming back to what is the really real? And a lot of people are wrestling with, okay, it's either Genesis and Jesus in the beginning, or it was a random chance. And that's the kind of, how was there something out of nothing? And how does Jesus in Genesis become the really real, that people are like, well, could it be this? But it be that? Like, there's a lot of confusion.
Yes.
So I think it'd be good to go into.
That's why this is such a important, powerful episode to me, because that's where we start. And I'm glad you have the whiteboard. Wasn't planning on using it, but you did, right? So what you are referring to is such a powerful concept. So if I draw, fall off, that's fine. If I draw a perfect circle here, that's all perfect, of course, the oval, and I say, okay, let's get everything out of this circle, the smudge, nothing in that, right? And what we're talking about here is, okay, so and this goes back, let's back up just a tiny bit. So Leibniz, the co-inventor of, I think he's the true inventor of calculus, but you can argue that he's the co-inventor, but we can have that conversation with Tucker someday.
He'll be excited.
He'll be excited for that, right?
He really wants to be on the podcast.
I don't love that. I can't wait for it.
We'll have that.
So if you take Leibniz was a polymath. He's probably one of, I would argue, top 10 greatest minds I've ever to walk the planet Earth, right? Jesus being number one, Paul being number two, then you can fill in like probably Aristotle, and we can go on down that road. But I think he's in that conversation. And with that, Leibniz not only is monumental in calculus, he's also the inventor of binary code. So we have no computers without Leibniz, right? Remember this?
Yes.
And so he's the one that actually, as a philosopher, because again, he was a polymath, he's the one that asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And philosophically, I think that's one of the greatest questions that we should ponder and hopefully have an answer for.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot of philosophical questions. You know, who am I? Where do I go when I die? We can answer all those worldview questions. Very important. But the question of why is there something rather than nothing is one that we start with. Because here's the thing on the thought experiment. If I have a circle that has nothing in it, and I wait, let's just wait 10 minutes, well, we're up 10 seconds, right? Nothing shows up. Well, what if we wait a year, 10 years, a million years, a billion years, 14 billion years? There's nothing going to show up in that circle. Why? Because there's nothing to bring something into existence. So if you have nothing, in the beginning there was nothing, you don't all of a sudden out of the nothingness have something. Now, I know my quantum physicists are going to argue something different in translogical thinking. We need to get into that. It's a very high-end, different conversation. We'll have it a different day. But if we're going to use our Aristotelian logic of law of just normal logic, if you start with nothing, you end with nothing. Right?
This equals this.
This, exactly. You can't have this nothing, and also now the nothingness, something emerges. Now, there are people that have enough faith to say, get this, in the beginning there was nothing, and something emerged. Let me ask you, you have two lines of thought on that. In the beginning there was nothing, and the nothingness in and of itself brought everything into existence, or in the beginning was nothing, and something brought everything into existence. There's two ways to look at that, okay? But nothing begots nothing. Nothing leads, like you were saying, leads to nothing. You don't have nothing plus nothing equals something. It's illogical. It's foolishness unless you have an incredible amount of faith, right? And again, like I said, that whole concept of atheists have a deep faith because they believe nothing plus nothing equals everything. Great. That's a worldview. And as we will talk about, worldviews don't negate one another. Which one, the question really is, which worldview has enough logic, reason, and scientific background to say, it's kind of rising up above the others, right? Which is why if we start with nothing, we say in the beginning there was nothing, now that nothing, something emerged, I'm like, okay, I'm not going down that road. Which is why, for me, it's very easy to close that, which we talked about in episode 2, close that atheistic door. So the logical thing is, because we see something, we're not solipsists. I mean, we don't believe that we're all a figment of everyone else's imagination type of thing. We really do believe that there is, cotton that makes up a gene or whatever. There is something. Therefore, something, if it equals something, and we back up that equation, there had to be something. Because something plus something equals something. That's where you all said, okay, if there's nothing, in the beginning there was nothing, and out of the nothingness something emerged. A force had to act on that in order to get nothing to become something. Which is exactly what happens in Genesis 1:1. Because as we back up that question of what's the really real, what is then really real? Well, it's not particles. It's not space. It's not energy. It's not time, whatever. Then what is really real? Where do we start? What's the bedrock? What's that corner foundation of my entire worldview? There has to be something because we have something. Therefore, what is the absolute something? What is the absolute really real of reality? Simple. We've been told. We've been revealed. It's been revealed to us. In the beginning, the Trinity said, let us make man in our image. No, wait a minute. What? Let us make man in our image? What the really real is, this is Anstineism. This isn't Schaeffer or one of my great favorites like Chesterton or Lewis. The really real, as a scientist who loves Jesus, is the perfect interplay of Father, Son, Spirit. Before any particle, before any space, before any metric tensors, any of this great math that we can talk about with Tucker, before any of that was brought in to the logos, to the order of the universe, you had the perfect interplay between Father, Son, and Spirit. It was perfect. It was perfect love. It was perfect peace, perfect joy, very patient. Anything you can do with the fruit of the Spirit was perfect. And it was that perfection that said, let us think of you, think of you, think of me. We were thought of in that moment when the Trinity said, let us. And in order for them to let us be a reality, they just, okay, let's breathe the universe. Let's breathe space. Let's breathe energy. Let's breathe the periodic table. Let's breathe organic molecules. Let's breathe all this. And that's where you get the beautiful narrative of Genesis 1 and 2. And so the really real is the loving interplay of a perfect triune God, which I can't wait for our triune perfectum. But the triune God having us in mind saying, let us breathe. Let's build and invite these little creatures to dance with us. And that's a C.S. Lewisism, right? Invite us into the holy dance of the Trinity. And that's what you and I have. That's what we're invited into. That to me is the really real.
Yeah.
That's where our journey starts. Right? And I don't know how much time we have. Rachel, where are we on time?
I definitely forgot to start my timer.
Okay, but
so I think we have like 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Because that, go ahead, are there questions there? Because that then does, not, and this wasn't even planned, that does segue into what humanity is.
Which I guess, I don't know if you have any questions, but to start out with, kind of to play almost devil's advocate, or to say like, in that in order for there to go from nothing to something, there has to be a force going into it. So for somebody who may not believe in Jesus or in the Trinity or in the Bible at all, why wouldn't it be any other God that people, worship or think that is the true God, or the Mormon God, or whatever, like, why is it ours? And I know that's deep. That's all I have. And I think that might need to be a whole nother episode.
Well, because you asked the question, I want to address it, right? This is a great Free for All Friday question, right? That's maybe how I view that. If you go back and read Koreshi's book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, okay, great book. And unfortunately, Koreshi passed away several years ago from cancer. But in that book, and I would encourage everyone to read that book, because Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. Okay, it's actually a DVD form. If you don't want to spend time reading the book, you can kind of see the overview of the DVD. Phenomenal story. And he was pre-med. He was in med school with a buddy of his. His buddy's name was David. And there's some really cool stuff in there with organic chemistry and resonance structures. It was such a cool book. But in that book, what struck him, what he talks, and we'll just talk about Allah for a second, because we could talk about Joseph Smith and some of those other things. But that's a whole other can of worms.
Oh yeah,
because we have to understand the importance of Adam being God, and that's a different worldview that we'd have to unpack at a different time. Yeah. So, but because of that question, one of the things that was the tension between his buddy, they were pre-med. I think they were pre-med together, David and Koreshi. David was a follower of Jesus. Koreshi was a follower of Allah. And as they would have their little banter, Qureshi would say, no, all is one, he has no son, right? And that's in the Quran. All is one, basically a singularity, he has no son. And what happens with that, if God is truly a singular entity, how does that singularity express love? There's no way. One cannot express love to another because that one has no other one with which to have agape with. So the problem with a singularity is a singularity isn't big enough to address the issue of a love that's extended to you and I. So all of being a singularity, all is one, has no son, meaning, and that's specifically as, no, we're not talking about the God of the Bible. We're talking about a very different God. And that's a whole other thing we could go down on who Allah is then, biblically. Because it is a subset of the biblical truth in the moon god, but that's a whole other, again, like I said, topic. But in that singularity, there's no way to extend that love to humanity like you and I have. So when you see the Trinity, you have perfection in one, but one in three. And that is a mystery. We will never resolve that. We will never fully understand it. It is one of those that, and if we could understand it, we'd probably be equal to it. So that's why one of those, it is a mystery. And I'm not going to say, here's what it looks like, and I'm going to explain it to you. Yeah. It's not it. Because, and this gets into the Omnitriune Perfectum, that triad, hopefully in episode 4, that we can flesh out a little bit. But that idea of we have this perfection in one entity with three individuals that are experiencing this perfection, that they say together, let us invite you into our experience. That's exactly what we see coming out of the Old and New Testament.
And I also feel like that's logical as well, because looking at the relationships we have on earth, in order to love, it's like we came from a mom and a dad, and they loved each other before, obviously, then we have kids. And in order to have that, how could we have that if we came from a singular person? That doesn't make logical sense.
It doesn't make, from what we know, right?
Yes.
With our observation.
From our observation.
Yes.
Our eyes, ears.
Everyone on this earth came from a mom and a dad, right? Mom, dad, child. There's your triune. There's your, again, there's your, we need to flesh that out. But there's your Trinity. And that Trinity idea is one of those that it's not some weird Christian thing. And that's why I think episode 4 needs to flesh out that whole concept of 3 and 1, 1 and 3.
Yeah. So I think we'll kind of wrap up this episode so that we can talk about triads in the next episode. But to define ontology, because we mentioned that at the very beginning of the episode, I know that kind of ties into what we've been talking about this whole episode. But what does ontology mean?
Okay, so the ontological reason for the existence of God is one of those ideas that ontology is basically what does it mean to be? What is the study of being, a human being, God being? Basically, who am I? Who is God? What does it mean for me to be who I am? That again, ontological or ontology has a very broad. That to me is the important part of what I want to flesh out. What does it mean to be human? Right? If you have a triune God, if the really real really is that the nature of absolute reality really is a triuneness of a God saying, let us make, and here we are, because of that love that was extended to us in the perfect love of the Trinity. Then what's it mean to be human? Who are we?
And what's our purpose?
What's our purpose? Well, what am I? Why me? And that to me is this almost like the second piece of the puzzle. Because if ultimate reality is the Trinity, and the Trinity says, let us, well then who's us? Right? Because in a human-centric reality, right? Because my life's all about me. Right? That country song is all about me, I, number one, whatever that country song is. There is that idea of who am I then? Why am I here? What's going to happen to me when I die? All those worldview questions now start to me emerge from the idea of the really real, right? So when Jesus is saying, in I am the way, I am the truth, I am truth. Here's the fascinating thing I want to maybe end with, or I don't want this to be missed. When Jesus and Pilate have that amazing conversation right before the crucifixion, right? And we know this story because we've probably heard it at church, at least a dozen times if we've been kicking around the church very long. But in that dialogue, you've got a person who's claiming to be the embodiment of truth, Jesus, in the context of a person who's probably highly Greek trained in his thinking. He's Roman, but again, he's going to be thinking through this Greek paideia of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and all these great thinkers, and so the idea of truth is not foreign to him. So when Jesus brings in this idea of truth, and he starts talking about this concept of truth, and Pilate says, "What is truth?" Right? He kind of dismisses Jesus, like Jesus' even words. What's happening there is something very powerful. Pilate, in his Greek worldview, his Greek thinking, his Greek background, paideia, his enculturation, he's thinking truth is an abstract concept. 2 + 2 = 4. Triangles have 3 sides, 3 angles, right? Very abstract. So when he brushes Jesus off with the what is truth, the error that he makes is he thinks truth, he's been taught that truth is an abstract concept. Truth is a what? And he's standing in the very presence of truth. And the truth has some abstract qualities to it. What Jesus is saying is, truth is bigger than what you're thinking. I am truth. I am. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Exodus 3. I am truth. I am way. I am truth. I am life. I am the very I am that spoke to Moses. You are standing in the very presence of absolute reality. Mm-hmm. And you're not even asking the right question. Mm-hmm. You're asking what is truth, not who is true. Mm-hmm. He's standing in the great presence of the who, the great who. And he's Greeking out on it. The what? Because that's his mindset. He doesn't realize the bigness that he's standing. If Jesus is who he claims he is, who he claims to be, mm-hmm. which the three of us are followers of him. So mm-hmm. we're trying to follow this guy, right? This truth. He's so much bigger than this narrowness that Pilate tries to put him into. And that's why, to me, going back to your question, I would start with an absolute bedrock of truth.
Right.
What does that mean?
Right. And it's easy for us to be like, Pilate, he didn't know who he was in front of, but it's like, we do that all the time. We're always asking the wrong questions.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
And so, like, we have to, or we're always identify with Pilate in that situation.
Yeah. That is so good.
Yeah.
That is so good. I'm constantly asking the wrong questions, right? It's like we talked about when we will talk about the law of identity, right? We're going past each other because we're not even in the same... Mm-hmm. We're really not in the same conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, we might be using the same words.
Yeah.
But we're not having a rational conversation.
Yeah.
And honestly, a lot of frustration in the church. A lot of people have walked away from Jesus. Or I should say the church. I don't think people walk away from Jesus. That's a whole other podcast. Yeah. We'll hopefully at some point get into, because there's a huge concept there about you lose your salvation and that whole conversation. Really important things that when we grow up in the church, these are conversations that we kind of get bogged down in.
Yeah. And that conversation makes me excited for our series on the armor, because I really do want to dive deeper into truth and what that means. But I think we're going to have to wrap this one up, and then we'll get into triads in the next episode. Hopefully that kind of resolved some of the things that we left off with in the last episode, and then went deeper into all things ontology.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and be sure to tune in next time to learn about triads and more about truth.